Thank you so much for watching this video as we begin this new series called Simple Stories, Deep Meanings. We're going to look at the parables that Jesus tells. Parables are so important because while they are simple stories, they highlight very deep spiritual things that our Lord wanted us to know. While yes, He presents these things that are on the surface so simple, the parables actually teach some of the deepest, most troubling, most hard to grapple with truths that are presented to us in Jesus' teachings in the Gospels. Storytelling has always been an interesting and popular pastime. Not so much now because of all the different media types that we have in our world that compete for our attention, but spanning from the time before TV back, storytelling was always an important but useful and fun way for people to pass time. In fact, storytelling is more difficult than it seems on the surface. There are people who can tell a story that makes any story kind of boring. But then on the other hand, you have people who can craft a story well. They can lead up to the most important parts in a way that hooks your attention and keeps you on the edge of your seat for minutes on end as they walk you through these events, as they build to a climax and then unravel the story in a way that maybe you don't even expect. Storytelling is so important historically because that's the way that many people pass down their traditions. That's the way they pass down their history as people or nations. And so storytelling has always been important for a couple reasons. For one, it had an entertainment value, but also historically it had an incredible importance in relaying history to younger generations so that they could learn what has happened in the past. When we come to Jesus' parables, though, these are stories that, yes, are captivating to audiences, but as we'll see today, they have a variety of different purposes. And so as we begin thinking about parables and these stories that Jesus tells, I want us to look at Luke chapter 15. And here in this chapter, Jesus tells three very distinct stories. He tells a story about 100 sheep. One goes missing. One is lost. And so the shepherd leaves the 99 and he goes and looks for the one that is lost. He tells a story about one woman who has these 10 coins. One goes missing. And so she lights a lamp and she searches and sweeps through her entire house to find the one missing coin. And then as the climax of the three, you have the story of what we call the Prodigal Son. These two brothers, one leaves home, and as Jesus tells about his return, he makes some very important applications to what's going on around him. But Jesus' parables are so important because of what they offer to us theologically, about what they teach us about our world. But he does this in a way that is very easy for us to follow because parables, very first, are generalized stories. As you think about the parables, there's not a lot of firm and very specific details. They are meant to be something that anybody could experience, things that everybody could identify with. Now, there are some things that you may not be acquainted with. If you don't know how farming works at all in any kind of way, well, maybe parables will be a little difficult when Jesus talks about agricultural things. There are some parables that, yes, you need to know a small detail here or there about the world that he lived in order for the parable to make sense. But overall, these are stories that anybody could pick up and read and understand. I think we see this very clearly as we look at the beginning of the prodigal son. Luke 15, beginning in verse 11. And Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to the father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. I wonder how often people would ask, well, that could happen to anybody. Who is Jesus talking to? And in a sense, because parables are so generalized, that's the point of the parable. It's for it to be so applicable that people in the first century listening to Jesus goes, I think I've heard about something over there happening that was just like this. It was a story that they understood. But even in the 1500s, as people were reading, couldn't you see this happening in the medieval centuries? And then even today, how often, although things don't work quite this way, can you see a little pretentious guy going to his father and asking for his inheritance early, and then going off into a faraway place outside the monitoring of his father, and he blows all of his money on whatever he wants to do. I think throughout the centuries, everybody can read this story and they see what this is like in their own mind's eye. They are able to paint the picture of all the little details that are not specified. Where he lived, where he goes, all of those things. We get to create those details in our own mind because Jesus, what he tells us, is very general. Now, what we do with those is kind of neat because everybody, regardless of who we are, we fill in the gaps and we make these mental pictures about what all these things look like with things that are current, things that are relevant to us. But I think we also see how powerful these generalized lessons can be. As we look at Matthew chapter 13, here in verse 44, Jesus talks about a hidden treasure in a field. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. Again, people hear this story and they get it. Automatically, they see what this is like. They can picture the field in their mind. They can picture what it's like for you to stumble upon treasure and the excitement. And then he goes and he covers up everything that he found. He goes, he sells everything he has. And whether you're doing that in the first century, whether you're doing that in the 21st century, and you're selling all of your property on eBay or in a pawn shop, we can fill all those details out for ourselves. But we see the main point. The main point is that in all of his excitement, he would do anything to get the treasure he has found. Jesus says that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's being willing to do anything so that you can have the most important thing, the most valuable thing. Heaven is so valuable. But the people that Jesus first tells this story to, they immediately get it because there are no banks in the first century. There is no safe place that you can go and put a deposit in for all of your money. No, if you want to keep something safe, you hid it. And so maybe even some of the people listening in the back of their mind goes, I wonder what would happen if somebody found the stash that I have made, the hidden treasure that I have buried. They know what this is like. And they can also picture what it would be like to stumble upon someone else's hidden fortune and how they would do anything possible to receive it for themselves. But then one of the most fascinating components of parables is that parables show us who the real insiders and the real outsiders are. Parables, when I was growing up, we were told that they were an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And I think that's a good working definition, especially for children as they begin to think about what parables look like. I think it's an adequate definition. But for adults, I think that we can push our definition of what parables are supposed to be and what they're supposed to look like far, far deeper. And we build a stronger appreciation for the parables when we see them as more than just a cute story that Jesus told to illustrate a purpose. Sometimes the parables were absolutely gripping. Sometimes they were divisive. Sometimes they were controversial. There were things within the parables that would make people stop and back up and wonder, did I just hear all of that right? How can that be that that's the way the story ends? A couple good examples. We go back to the story of the Prodigal Son. This son goes and he is wayward. He spends all that he has. He wastes his money. More than that, it's his father's money. It's his inheritance. He wastes all that he has. He has to go and loan himself out to this farmer who makes him feed pigs. And eventually he decides, I need to make a change. I need to go home. I need to ask my father to have me as one of his hired hands. And so as he goes home, you know how the story goes. His father embraces him and welcomes him home. He is so happy that his son has returned back to the farm. But it's not so that he can be a hired hand. He takes him back as a son. And as he embraces his son, he throws this great party. And here's the part that gets a little wonky for people who, in their minds, when they first hear this story, they know how all of this ends. The plot twist that Jesus gives is that there are people who would actually be unhappy that the son returned. But more than that, the plot twist is it's his older brother. You see, it's not somebody outside the family who is enraged. Rather, it's somebody who should be so excited that his brother has returned. And so as you see the dialogue between the father and the older son, you realize that the older son is actually one with complex problems. It is not that the younger son is wayward and he is the problem child and he makes a mess of everything. No, what we're left with in the story of the prodigal son is that there's this older son who is unforgiving, who is hard-hearted, who is arrogant about himself and the ways that he is. And he flaunts that in front of his father. He says, I've never done all of these things that my younger brother did. In fact, he calls him your son. He doesn't acknowledge that he's his brother. And so we're left with something to grapple with. We see the same thing happen in the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. As we think about the story of the Good Samaritan, it's a basic enough story. It's a very generalized story. There is a man who is traveling down a road that historically was known to be a dangerous place. And as he's on his trip, he falls among robbers. And they rob him, they beat him, they strip him of everything that he has, and they leave him for dead. Now, here's the way that the story continues. Jesus is talking to a Jewish audience. And so in his mind, as he builds this story, they are waiting and they probably build some expectation of who is going to come to the rescue. First, he says there is a priest, one of the chosen people of Israel, who is coming along the road, but he doesn't help the man. He passes by on the other side. And then there is this Levite. He is the tribe of the priests, but he is himself not a priest, but he would be seen as prominent in Israel. But he walks by on the other side. He doesn't help the man. I think that everybody listening to this story is waiting for the average Israelite to be the savior of the story. They're waiting with anticipation. Oh, it's not a priest. It's not a Levite. I think it's going to be a common person. It's going to be one of us. We get to be the hero. And then Jesus lays on them the third person. A Samaritan is coming down the road. Now, what you and I have to understand about this is the relationship between Jews and Samaritans. There is a huge, huge hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. And it was a race issue. When the Israelites in the Old Testament were taken into captivity, there were some people who were left and they intermarried with some of these folks who had ultimately kicked them out of their homeland and taken them far away. And so when the Jews return from captivity, they have stayed pure in their lineage. They have only married Jews, and they come back and they realize that there are people that they call Samaritans who have not honored God's wishes, who have not only married within the nation of Israel. And so they saw them as these half-breed people. They're these people of mixed lineage. And they would be appalled at the idea of a Samaritan. Of all people, a Samaritan got to be the hero of the story. But Jesus' story goes to the very heart of what is going on. And as he confronts this lawyer who has began all of this by asking, ultimately, who is my neighbor? As a way to test him, Jesus turns the tables to him and he says, so who did right? Who is the neighbor to the man who was beaten and left for dead? And he can't even bring himself to say, well, it was the Samaritan. He just simply says, the one who showed him mercy. You want to talk about a story that was out of place for Israelite ears, for people with Jewish ears who would have never dreamed that Jesus would let a Samaritan be the hero of the story. Well, this is a gripping story. And it shows who the real insiders are, who the real outsiders are. It shows that God doesn't favor people because of the ways that people favor people. God looks at our hearts and He looks at our actions, and anybody can be the hero of the story based on how they treat their fellow man. But then as we continue, parables, and we're building to this point, parables often depend on their context. If you really want to see what a parable is about, go to its context, read what's around it, and say, what is Jesus telling this story for? What purpose is it going to serve? Is He trying to highlight something that is going on? Is He addressing something that's happened before or after the parable? We walk away seeing greater meaning, deeper meaning, and we see that Jesus uses parables in an incredible way to teach us many things. We've been talking about the prodigal son, and I want us to back up one chapter. We've been reading in Luke 15, but now I want us to begin in the beginning of Luke 14. And here we're going to see some context as to why Jesus is going to tell these three parables: the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son, or the lost son, as you might think in context of the three. Begin in verse 1. One Sabbath, when they went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things. You see, who Jesus is telling these stories for is not for the people who are going to be wayward. He's not talking about this because there is going to be a sheep that departs, or a coin that gets lost, or a son that goes away and comes back. Instead, he talks about the mood of the people who are watching. When the sheep is lost and the shepherd brings it back, he calls all of his friends and he says, "Rejoice with me, for I had a lost sheep and now it's found." There was rejoicing, as there should be. When the lady who loses one of her coins finds the coin, she calls her friends and says, "Let's party. Let's have a celebration because what I've lost has returned back," and rejoicing is the right thing to do. And then when the parable of the prodigal son comes around, this son who was wayward, he comes back, he finds his way. The father throws a party because he says there must be rejoicing. But who is the older brother? Well, I think it's those Jews, those Pharisees, who are angry, who are upset because good has been done. As Jesus talks about these people who are lost, but because of him coming to this world will be found, they would talk about things in terms of that's not right for God to let them back into a relationship with him. It's not right that they get to go away and come back. And they have all these expectations as to what God ought to do. And Jesus is talking about in this parable the mindset of the older brother that's found within these people sitting next to him at a feast, who would balk at the idea of the Son of God healing a man just because it's the Sabbath, or balk at the idea that he would do good when tradition said he shouldn't. As God's son, he was right to do what he did, but they were silently upset because he had done good, because it was the Sabbath. If you want to see another example of how this works, we could think about the parable of the mustard seed. We find it in Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 30. This is what Jesus said. "With what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable shall we use for it? It is like a grain of mustard seed, which, when sown on the ground, is the smallest of all seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes larger than all the garden plants and puts out large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. With such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples, he explained everything. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd, They took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling, but he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Jesus here has been talking about how such a small amount of faith goes such a long way when it grows. And here even his disciples, even though they are following him, they don't understand the power of faith. They don't understand to trust in Jesus because of the power that he has from the Father. And so Jesus, if you read the context, it becomes so apparent how this parable is going to play into their situation. And it gives us a deeper appreciation for this very short story that Jesus tells. When we see Jesus using parables, he tells such simple stories. They're not complex. They're not difficult to understand. They're easy stories, simple stories, and with them he teaches deep meanings. How important is it for us as believers, as followers of Christ, to think about the most important stories he told and say, what am I supposed to see from this? Being able to read and appreciate the parables will help us more than anything to clarify and deepen our love and our respect and our understanding of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus was a master storyteller, and as he tells some of the greatest stories ever recorded, we can learn great things from them. I hope that you'll continue in this series with us as we think about the parables of the Bible.